Hi, I'm Sharyn from Wyndham City Libraries. Welcome back to Teen Read Along for Chapter 6 of Tomorrow When the War Began by John Marsden. The group are now running low on food and start making their way home. They notice 6 fires in the distance, which is unusual as it's not fire season, though they don't think much of it. Let's read Chapter 6.
The dogs were dead. That was my first thought. They didn't jump around and bark when we drove in, or moan with joy when I ran over to them, like they always had done. They lay beside their galvanised iron humpies, flies all over them, oblivious to the last warmth of the sun. Their eyes were red and desperate, and their snouts were covered with dried froth. I was used to them stretching their chains to their limits. They did that in their manic dancing whenever they saw me coming, but now their chains were stretched and still, and there was blood around their necks where their collars had held. Of the 5 dogs, 4 were young. They shared a water bucket, but somehow they had knocked it over and lay on its side, dry and empty. I checked them quickly, in horror, one by one, all dead. I ran to Millie, their old mother, whom we'd separated from the young dogs because they irritated her. Her bucket was still standing and held a little water. As I came close to her, she suddenly gave a feeble wag of her tail and tried to stand. I was shocked that she was still alive, after I'd made up my mind that she too must be dead. The rational thing to do would have been to leave her and rush into the house, because I knew that nothing so awful could have happened to the dogs unless something more awful had happened to my parents. But I had already stopped thinking rationally. I slipped Millie's chain off and the old dog staggered to her feet, then collapsed forward onto her front knees. I decided, brutally, that I couldn't spend any more time with her. I'd helped her enough. I called to Corrie, "Do something for the dog," and started running for the house. Corrie was already moving that way. Her mind was working faster than the others, who were still standing around looking shocked, starting to realise that something was wrong, but not making the connections that I was making. I was making them too fast, and that was adding to my terror. Corrie hesitated, turned toward the dogs, then called to Kevin, "Look after the dogs, Kev." Then she followed me. In the house, nothing was wrong, and that was what was wrong. There was no sign of life at all. Everything was neat and tidy. At the time of day, there should have been food spread out onto the kitchen table. There should have been dishes in the sink. The TV should have been chattering in the background, but all was silent. Corrie opened the door behind me and came in quietly. "Jesus, what happened?" she said, not as a question. The tone of her voice terrified me even more. I just stood there. "What's wrong with the dogs?" she asked. "They're all dead except Millie, and she's nearly dead." I was looking around for a note to me, but there was nothing. "Let's ring someone," she said. "Let's ring my parents." "No, ring Homer's parents. They're the nearest. They'll know." She picked up the phone and handed it to me. I turned it to talk and started pressing numbers, then realised that I'd heard no dial tone. I held it closer to my ear. There was nothing. I felt a new kind of fear now, a kind of fear I hadn't even known about before. "There's nothing," I said to Corrie. "Oh, Jesus," she said again. Her eyes got very wide and she started going quite white. Robin and Fee came into the kitchen with the others close behind them. "What's happening?" they were asking. "What's wrong?" Kevin came in carrying Millie. "Get her some food from the cool room," I said. "I'll go," Homer said. I tried to explain everything, but I got confused trying to do it as quickly as possible and ended up taking too long. So I stopped and just said wildly, "We've got to do something." At that moment, Homer came in with a bowl of mince and a smell. "The power's off in the cool room," he said. "It stinks terrible." "Terribly," I said in absent-minded fear. He just looked at me. Robin went to the TV as Homer and Kevin tried to persuade Millie to eat. We watched as she switched on the set, but it too was dead. "This is weird," she said. "Did they say they were going away?" Fee asked. I didn't bother to answer. "If your grandmother got sick," Corrie said. "So they cut off the power?" I asked us sarcastically. "Some big electrical problem," Kevin suggested. "Maybe if the power was off for days they had to move." "They'd have left a note," I snapped. "They wouldn't let the dogs die." There was a moment's silence. No one knew what to say. "There's just no explanation that fits all this," Robin said. "It's like UFO stuff," Kevin said, "like aliens had taken them away." Then seeing the expression on my face, he quickly added, "I'm not trying to make a joke of it, Ellie. I know something bad's happened. I just can't figure out what it could possibly be." Lee whispered something to Robin. I didn't bother to ask him what it was. When I saw the naked fear on Robin's face, I didn't want to ask. I made a big mental effort to get control of myself. "Let's get back to the Land Rover," I said. "Bring the dog. We'll go down to Homer's." "Wait a sec," Lee said. "Have you got a transistor radio? A battery one?" Yes. I don't know where," I said, looking at him strangely. I still didn't know what he had in mind, but I didn't like the look on his face any more than I'd liked the look on Robin's. "Why?" But I didn't want him to answer. I've got my Walkman in the Land Rover, Robin said. He turned to her. Have you heard any news bulletins since we've been away? No. I tried a few times to pick up radio stations, but I couldn't get any. I guess the cliffs around Hell cut them off. Can you find your radio? Lee said to me. I guess. I ran to my bedroom. I didn't want to be wasting time like this. I desperately wanted to get to Homer's place and run into kind Mrs. Janos and have her hug me and hold me and explain everything away, so that it became just a simple little mistake. But there was something terrible in Lee's mind and I couldn't ignore it. I came back with the radio, switching it on as I rushed along the corridor, spinning the tuner to find a station. By the time I got to the kitchen, I'd already scanned the whole range once and got nothing but static. Must have gone too fast, I thought, like I always do. I never learn. I started the second search as the others waited anxiously, uncomprehending. This time I was slow and careful, but the result was the same. Nothing. Now we were all really frightened. We looked at Lee, as though we expected him magically to have the answer. He just shook his head. I don't know, he said. Let's get to Homer's. As with the radio, so with the Land Rover. I revved it so hard and dropped the clutch so roughly that Kevin, who was still sitting down, hit his head and hurt it, nearly dropping Millie, whom he was still nursing. The little landy kangaroo hopped a few metres and stalled. I could hear Grandma's voice saying, more haste, less speed. I took a deep breath and tried again, more calmly. This time was better. We went out the gate and down the road, with me saying to Homer, I forgot to check the chooks. Okay, Allie, he said, it'll be cool. We'll work it out. But he didn't look at me, just sat forward on the seat, peering anxiously through the windscreen. Homer's place was about 1.5 k's from ours. The one thing we wanted to see, the only thing, as we approached, was movement. There was none. As we bumped over the cattle grid, I was pressing the horn, making it roar, until Lee called out urgently from the back, Don't do that, Allie. Again, I was scared to ask why, but I stopped pressing the horn. We skidded hard to a halt near the front door, and Homer hit the ground running. He flung the door open and ran in, calling, Mum! Dad! But before I'd even left the driver's seat, the hollowness of his voice gave me my answer. I walked towards the door. As I did so, I heard the Land Rover start up behind me. I turned and looked. Lee was at the wheel. I watched. He was a terrible driver, but with much over-revving, he got the vehicle into the shadows under the big old peppercorn tree behind the tank stand. Memories of a light-hearted conversation in hell suddenly came back to me. And suddenly I knew, and I hated and feared the memory. Lee climbed out of the car and came walking towards me, heading for the front door. I screamed at him, Lee, you're wrong. Stop doing these things. Stop thinking these things. You're wrong. Robin came up behind me and grabbed my arm. He probably is, she said, but the radio. She paused. Hold yourself together, Allie, just till we know. We walked into the house together. As we went through the front door into the bleak, dead silence, she added, Pray hard, Allie. Pray really hard. I am. I could hear a bellowing noise from out of the back of the house, so I walked straight through to the yard and found Homer, grim-faced, trying to milk their cow. Milk was leaking from her teats, and she was shifting uncomfortably and bellowing whenever he tried to touch her. Can you milk, Allie? He asked quietly. No, sorry, Homer, I never learned. I'll ask the others. As I went back in, he called out, The budgie in the sunroom, Allie. Okay, I called and ran. But Corrie had already reached the budgie, who was alive, but with just a little bit of mouldy water in its cage. We bought him fresh water, which he drank like Dad with his first beer after shearing. You've got a milker at home, haven't you? I asked Corrie. Can you take over from Homer, out the back? Sure, she said, and went. We all started acting with unnatural calmness. I knew how frightened Corrie and the others must now be for their own families, but there was nothing we could do for them quite yet. I took the budgie into the kitchen, where Lee was putting down the phone. I raised my eyebrows at Lee. He shook his head. Homer came in a moment later. There's an RF radio in the office, he said, without looking at anyone. What's an RF radio? Fee asked. I hadn't noticed her standing in the door of the pantry. Rural firefighting, Homer said briefly. Would it be safe? Robin asked. I don't know, Homer said. Who knows anything? With desperate urgency, passionate to convince them, I said, This is ridiculous. I know what you're thinking. It's completely, absolutely impossible. Absolutely not possible. These things just don't happen. Not here. Not in this country. Then with sudden hope I remembered something. Those fires. They'll be out fighting those fires. There must have been some bad ones. So bad they couldn't get back. Homer, said Allie, they weren't that kind of fire. You know that. You know what a bad fire looks like. Lee said, I don't know much about these things, but shouldn't your RF radio be alive with voices with those fires are burning? Yes, said Homer, turning in a hurry. But there's no power, Fee said. They have backup batteries, I said. We rushed after Homer and crowded into the little office. Homer's turning the volume knob on the radio up to full, but there was no need. Endless, monotonous static filled the room. "Did you check the frequency?" I asked him quietly. Homer nodded, his face full of misery. I wanted to hug him, looked for Fee to see if she might be going to, then went ahead when I realised she'd left the room again. "What do you think, Ally?" Lee asked me. I knew I had to admit all the possibilities now. I remembered how tense things had been before we left, all those politicians shouting and carrying on. Trying to think calmly, I said, "The only reason for calling up would be if we can get help for our families, if they're in trouble or danger. But if they are, everyone must be in the same boat, and the authorities must know about it, so we wouldn't be helping our families by transmitting the call. The only other reason for calling is because we're so desperate to find out. But, okay, I admit we may create danger for ourselves." I tried to keep my voice steady. "If there's something bad happened, if there's people out there..." "So on balance?" Lee asked. "I don't think we should call," I said sadly. "I agree," Homer said. "Me too," Lee said. "Then it's Corrie's turn," Homer said, "and Kevin's. I don't even know where Robin lives." "Just outside town," I said. "Well, I guess geographically Corrie and Kevin come first." He looked at Lee, who nodded without speaking. He'd already figured out who was last. The seven of us came together in the kitchen with almost perfect timing. Corrie carrying a bucket of milk. The milk stank. It looked like pale scrambled eggs. Kevin was with her. They were gripping each other's hands, hanging on tight. I poured some of the milk into a salad bowl and gave it to Millie, who at last started to show some enthusiasm. She sniffed it, then lapped it eagerly. Kevin said to Homer, "Do you mind if we go to our places? We'll go on our own if we have a vehicle, or..." He looked at me. "The Land Rover?" "Dad said I was the only..." I started, then stopped, realising how weak it sounded. But I'd done enough logical thinking in the Yano's office. Robin took over. "We've got to think, guys. I know we all want to rush off, but this is one time we can't afford to give in to feelings. There could be a lot at stake here, lives even. We've got to assume that something really bad is happening, something quite evil. If we're wrong, then we can laugh about it later. But we've got to assume that they're not down the pub or gone on a holiday." "Of course it's bad," I yelled at her. "Do you think my dad would leave his dogs to die like that? Do you think I'll be having a good laugh about that tomorrow?" I was screaming and crying at the same time. There was a pause. Then suddenly everyone lost control. Robin started crying and yelling, "I didn't mean it that way, Ellie. You know I didn't." Corrie was shouting, "Shut up! Everyone, shut up!" Kevin was rubbing his fingers through his hair, going, oh God, what's going on?" Fee had her hand in her mouth and looked like she wanted to eat it. She was so white I thought she was about to faint. Suddenly Homer madly said, "Fee, I've heard of biting your nails, but that's ridiculous." We all looked at Fee at that moment. Later we were all laughing, hysterical laughter, but it was laughter. Lee had had tears pouring down his face, but now had wiped them away and said quickly, "Let's listen to Robin. Come on, everyone." "I'm sorry, Robin," I said. "I know you didn't mean..." "I'm sorry too," she said. It was a bad choice of words. She took a deep breath and clenched her fists. You could see her calming herself, like she did at netball sometimes. At last she continued, "Look, everyone, I don't want to say much, just that we've got to be careful. If we go rushing around the countryside to 7 different houses, well, it mightn't be such a bright thing to do, that's all. We should decide some things, like whether to stick together or break into small groups, like Kevin and Corrie want to do. Whether we should use the vehicles, whether we should go any further in daylight. It's almost dark now. For a start, I suggest no one goes out from here until it's dark. Then that way, they don't use lights." "What do you think's happened?" I asked. "Do you think the same as Lee?" "Well," said Robin, "there's no sign of anyone leaving in a hurry, like in an emergency. They left some days ago, and they expected to come back some days ago. Now, what's something that everyone would have gone off to some days ago, expecting to come back? We all know the answer to that." "Commemoration Day," said Corrie. "The show." "Exactly." "Homer," I said, "is there some way you can tell if your parents came back from the show? I mean, if I'd thought of it before, I could have looked for a couple of our bulls that I know Dad was showing that he wouldn't have sold for any price, and he wouldn't have come back from the show without them. I mean, he would have kept those bulls in the bedroom if Mum had let him." Homer thought for a moment. "Oh yes," he said, "Mum's needlepoint. She enters a new piece every year. Then win, lose or draw, she brings it back and hangs it on her wall. She gets a big thrill putting it up there. Hang on a sec." He ran out and we waited in silence. He was back a moment later. "Nothing," he said. "It's not there." "Okay," Robin said. "Let's assume that a lot of people went to the show and didn't come back. And let's assume that since Commem Day all power and phones have been cut, all radio stations are off the air, and there have been a number of fires. And the people who went to the show wanted to come back but couldn't. Where does that get us? And there's the other thing, Lee said. Robin looked at him. Yes, she said. Lee continued. The night of the show, those hundreds of aircrafts, maybe even more than hundreds, they came in over the coast, flying low and at high speed. And without lights, I added, realising that the critical point for the first time. Without lights, Kevin said. You didn't tell us that. It didn't strike me, I said. You know how you notice something but not consciously? That's what it was like. Let's assume something else, Fee said. She sounded and looked angry. Let's assume that what you're saying is absolutely ridiculous. She sounded like me in the same room not very many minutes earlier. Hadn't I said absolutely ridiculous? But now I was starting to come around to Lee and Robin's way of thinking. The little point about the lights had made a difference to me. No legitimate aircraft, no aircraft on a legitimate mission would have been flying without lights. I should have registered at the time, and I was annoyed at myself that I hadn't. But Fee continued, there are dozens more likely theories. Dozens! I don't know why you won't consider them. Okay, Fee, fire away, said Kevin, but fire quickly. The strain was really showing in Kevin's face. All right, said Fee. Number 1, they're sick. They went to the show and got food poisoning or something. They're in hospital. Then the neighbours would have been here looking after the place, Homer said. They got sick too, said Fee. That doesn't explain why all the radio stations are off the air, said Corrie. Everyone's sick then, said Fee. There's a national problem with some illness or disease. That doesn't explain the planes, Robin said. They were just coming back from Commem Day, like we said. Without lights, and so many of them. Fee, I don't know if we even have that many planes. I don't know if our Air Force is that big. Okay, said Fee. There is some national emergency. Everyone's had to go and help. And the planes? It's the Air Force going to help. Maybe other countries' Air Forces too, all helping. Then why would they have no lights? Robin was shouting now, getting mad, like she did on the netball court. We don't know for sure, Fee was shouting too. Fee shouting? First time for everything, I thought. Fee continued. Ellie might have been wrong. It was just the middle of the night. She would have been half asleep. I mean, she only just thought to mention it now. She couldn't be that certain. I saw them, Fee, I said. I'm certain. It didn't strike me at the time. My eyes were working. It's just that my brain wasn't. Anyway, Robin saw them and Lee. Ask them. We didn't see them, Robin snapped. We only heard them. Everyone, calm down, Homer interrupted. Stay calm or we'll get nowhere. Come on, Fee, what else? I don't know, she said. I just think they've rushed off somewhere to help. Maybe some whales got stranded. So 2 lots of parents rush off without even leaving notes, Kevin asked. But if you take out the planes, said Fee, you haven't got nearly as much. Just some little local emergency. Don't forget the radio stations, Robin said. Lee spoke up. Fee, they're all valid theories. I'm not saying you're wrong. You're probably right. The planes are just a coincidence, and the radio can be explained away, and so on. But the thing that scares the sweat out of me is there is one theory that does fit all the facts, and so bloody neatly it's perfect. Remember our conversation that morning in hell, how Commemoration Day would be the ideal day to do it? Fee nodded dumbly, tears rolling down her face. We were all crying again now, even Lee, who kept talking as he wept. Maybe all my mother's stories made me think of it before you guys. And like Robin said before, if we're wrong, he was struggling to get the words out, his face twisting like someone having a stroke. If we're wrong, you can laugh as long and as loud as you want. But for now, let's say it's true. Let's say we've been invaded. I think there might be a war.
After seeing the jets and now the fires, Ali's increasingly anxious to return home to Wirrawee. What do you think the group will find when they return home? Join me again in the next episode for Chapter 7 of Tomorrow, When the War Began.